From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
Crime, also driven by marriage. Loneliness, isolation, depression, even polarization within our politics is also largely driven by the decline of marriage. And then, of course, there's the future of humanity. You're seeing this demographic decline, not just in this country, but across the world. And again, also being driven by the decline of marriage.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Conn Carroll, author of the recent book, Sex and the Citizen, How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. We'll talk in depth with Conn about that book a little bit later on in today's program. First, we're joined by Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College. Dr. Arnn has spent decades studying Winston Churchill, the great British statesman and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 1940 to 1945, also again from 1951 to 1955. Hillsdale has published the official biography of Winston Churchill. Dr. Arnn helped to complete it. We also have a website. You can find all sorts of info, winstonchurchill.hillsdale.edu. And we talked to Dr. Arnn today just after the 150th anniversary of Churchill's birth, November 30th, 1874, to discuss 3 reasons you might want to study Winston Churchill. Dr. Arnn, start us off. What's the first reason people might want to take a deeper look at Winston Churchill?
The first reason is he lived a big life. Big, I think, or bigger than any statesman who ever lived. He was in 4 wars. Became a best-selling author about those wars, both in books and in newspaper articles. Probably the most read person about those 4 wars. And then he turned 26 and got elected to Parliament. And then his life went on through writing almost 50 books, 8,000 closely printed pages of speeches, all written by him, very powerful and beautiful. The books are very worth reading. And he held every major office in the British government except Foreign Secretary, which he did part-time once during the Second World War. He was in both those big wars, hated them, tried to figure out how to fight them, tried to prevent them, wrote about them compellingly, what they mean as a phenomenon in the world, something new and something terrible. He understood the modern form of tyranny. We call it totalitarianism. We still have it in the world today. It is the most dangerous form of human association, the most destructive. And he predicted it, and he resisted it, and he made war against it, and he prevented it from coming to his country. That's a big life. Fun life, too. He had a great sense of humor. A lady said to him one time, "We're all worms, Winston." He said, "Yes, but I am a glowworm." Anybody who thinks of things like that, fun.
Dr. Arnn, the second reason that you say people might want to study Winston Churchill is he was a defender of self-government. How do we see that inside Churchill's life?
There are 2 things that are worth mentioning here, I think, that his life means. He understood his own life, and he understood the life of Britain in his time and America as a test whether we could choose and rule ourselves. The first paragraph of the Federalist Papers says, America is a test whether we can guide our lives by reflection and choice, or whether we must depend on accident and force. Churchill wanted people to be in control of their government because he believed that they were made by nature to be in control of their lives. He fought for that all his life. He trusted the people. He said wittily once, "Democracy is the worst form of government except all the other forms." He said of America, they'll always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. But they will eventually do it. He thought they were the best judge of their own lives. He was an enemy of something that we have a major battle about in America today. He was an enemy of bureaucracy. He thought legislatures ought to make laws. He thought laws should be few and simple. He wrote some very significant laws in his time, and they are simple. You can understand them. He thought that the law should be understandable to everybody so there wouldn't grow up a class of people to enforce the laws. He coined the phrase about the bureaucracy once, no longer civil, no longer servants. In that same speech, which was given in 1945, he said that the socialists could not achieve their ultimate aims without the use of a Gestapo. He said, of all the people on earth, the British should be the last to consent to be governed by a bureaucracy. Those are very telling things to say in the context of today and the things going on in today. Today in America, the government is half the economy. The power of government is concentrated in the most central government farthest away from the people. And there's a fight about that. Churchill has profound things to say about that. That's something that he means. He means self-government. He fought for it. It's the reason he hated Nazism. It's the reason the culminating thing in his life was the terrible choice made in May 1940 to carry on fighting against the Nazis, against overwhelming odds, which he knew would cost his country so much that it wouldn't be a great country anymore. And it was true. That's what happened. But he thought the risk of becoming associated with Hitler or falling in any sense under his influence was something to be prepared to die for, over. And he was. And he regretted the choice all his life. It's glorious and tragic. Churchill was a defender of self-government, the authority and right of every person to live a good life by his own lights.
Dr. Larry Arnn joining us, president of Hillsdale College, as we talk about 3 reasons you might want to study Winston Churchill. And Dr. Arnn, this third reason is that Churchill had some thoughts, some ideas into the ultimate purposes of life. What did he think and say?
Good politics protects our right to pursue the ultimate purposes of life. Them. Churchill was never a totalitarian. He never thought that you could go to heaven through the law, but he thought you ought to try, and you had a right to try. This is my favorite paragraph he ever wrote, and I'm going to read it to you. It's in an essay called 50 Years Hence. His essays are very worth reading, and this is one of the best of them. And in this, he did something he likes to do, which is predict the future. He actually was pretty good at that. Although another favorite saying of his was, the future, though imminent, is obscure. He says, he writes, I read a book the other day, and it traced the history of mankind from the birth of the solar system to extinction. There were 15 or 16 races of men which in succession rose and fell over periods measured by tens of millions of years. In the end, a race of beings was evolved which had mastered nature. A state was created whose citizens lived as long as they cared, enjoyed pleasures and sympathies incomparably wider than our own, navigated the interplanetary spaces, could recall the panorama of the past and foresee the future. You know, if we actually managed to embed artificial intelligence in ourselves, we might be able to do all that. Then he says, and Churchill liked the future, and he liked to think about it, and he, was an early aviator and helped to invent the tank to protect troops in warfare. And he describes this future, which kind of sounds like heaven on earth, right? And then he says the mood changes in a sentence. But what was the good of all that to them? What did they know more than we know about the answers to the simple questions which man has asked since the earliest? Why are we here? What is the purpose of life? Whither are we going? No material progress, even though it takes shapes we cannot now conceive, or however it may expand the faculties of man, can bring comfort to his soul. It is this fact, more wonderful than any that science can reveal, which gives the best hope that all will be well. You see what he's saying? We are not robots. We think about the future. We wonder who we are and why we're here. And the right to do that gives rise to, for example, the doctrines of the Declaration of Independence, that we are not the same thing as horses and may not be governed except with our consent. It also underscores the dignity of education, of speculation, of free thinking. Churchill was a defender of those things, and then what he adds is he was a man of immense practical wisdom, which we all need because we all have to make choices.
That's Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College. You can find much more at our website, winstonchurchill.hillsdale.edu. Read a bit of Winston Churchill as we continue to celebrate the anniversary of his birth, November 30th, 1874. Up next, we're joined by Conn Carroll to talk about his recent book, Sex and the Citizen, How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. All of our audio at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Conn Carroll. He is commentary editor at the Washington Examiner at washingtonexaminer.com, and also the author of the recent book, Sex and the Citizen, How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. Conn, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Why should we care about marriage? What do we know about its benefits for those who are involved, perhaps children involved? Why is marriage so important?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at pretty much any issue today, marriage has a huge impact on it. When you look at income inequality, the widening income inequality gap in this country is largely driven by the decline of marriage. Same with wealth inequality. Same with decreasing mobility. We used to grow in a country where not only did Americans generally live to out-earn and out-succeed their parents, but people believed it was possible. And neither of those are true today. The younger generations today don't believe the American dream exists, and it actually does not. And this is largely driven by the decline of marriage. Crime, also driven by marriage. Loneliness, isolation, depression, even polarization within our politics is also largely driven by the decline of marriage. And then, of course, there's the future of humanity. You're seeing this demographic decline, not just in this country, but across the world. And again, also being driven by the decline of marriage. So pick any issue you want out there. Marriage is a huge reason why the problem's growing.
And we'll come back to a couple of those issues later on in the conversation. Early in the introduction in Sex and the Citizen, you note that the acceptability of polygamy from 5% to, my recollection is correct, 25% or so in the span of 20 years, from 2004 through 2024, roughly. That's a huge jump. How do those numbers or the changing opinions of Americans on polygamy also factor into this discussion of marriage?
Yeah, well, even that number, the 5 to 25%, that doesn't show the concentration of that growth is on the younger generation. So you have a younger generation coming up, which has largely abandoned the idea or the placement of monogamy as the foundation of civil society. And they're just much more accepting of pretty much all sexual behavior as liberated as they want it to be. And, the whole point of the book is that this is a huge mistake for a number of reasons, mostly because we are actually hardwired to be monogamous, and that when we stray around that, and then that when we do not allow culture and the government to work together to help channel individual behavior into monogamous relationships. When we instead encourage the opposite, it's basically a denial of the soul. We are not allowing humans to reach their full potential.
You say we're hardwired to be monogamous. The polygamy supporters or other people who are on the assault against marriage would say that's not true at all. We never were supposed to be monogamous. We're always sort of sleeping around and doing what we want. Is that true? Where do we kind of start the idea of marriage?
Sure. Well, marriage actually is part of why we're human. It's what separates us from our ape ancestors. So when you look at kind of the history of marriage, you have people like Karl Marx and Engels who believed that humanity actually first existed in a promiscuous horde before marriage was then imposed on them by capitalism, property, and the church. And that's actually just false. They actually got that idea from an American anthropologist back in the 1800s, but that guy ended up being wrong. Long story short, there is no hunter-gatherer tribe that has ever been encountered that did not have monogamous marriage at the core of their society. And it is the core of foundation. It is through monogamy that humans bring 3 generations into what I call a long-term project of cooperative care to help mom get the calories and help she needs to raise a child. See, when you look at chimpanzees, not only do chimpanzees not help each other raise children, but the females within a chimpanzee troop will actually actively thwart each other, and the alpha females will actually, unfortunately, kidnap and starve the young children of the other chimpanzees. It's not until you get into a monogamous setting where you have a monogamous male partner there to protect all females, where you then have the children of his monogamous offspring recognizing the father and working with him. And then because it is the females chimpanzees that move at sexual maturity, it's only with monogamy that you have a grandparent, dad's mom, there to identify and see who her grandchildren are and then help out. And that is how you get 3 generations helping mom provide for children. And that is how we got our big brains and ended up conquering all 7 continents of the world.
Conn Carroll with us, his recent book, Sex and the Citizen, How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. We also hear that, marriage is, it's a creation of man to control women. In practice, does it work the other way around?
Yeah, so monogamy itself, which kind of separate from marriage, you can have polygamous marriages, but to be clear, polygamy was not something kind of weird that Mormons used to do and Muslims still do. It was actually the standard across humanity for pretty much all of recorded history. So as soon as you start having sedentary societies, as soon as you start having agriculture and property, then you start having people that kind of specialize in the use of force in war, and that's when you have kind of a stratified society where you have a few men that monopolize most of the women, which is not good for the men that are being oppressed, but it's not good for the women either. And so it's really not until you have Christianity come along that says, look, everyone has equal human dignity, and it is, just as the man has dominion over the woman's body, the woman also has equal dominion over the man's body. And that was what was truly revolutionary about Christianity and, ended up changing the entire world.
You sort of outline these 4 sexual revolutions: hunter-gatherers, the polygamous era, the agriculture lifestyle, then Christianity. But the book is not a faith-based argument for marriage. Does the idea of religion or faith need to have a space in this argument?
I mean, the literature is very clear that faith definitely helps sustain and build marriages. People who have faith, who practice faith, who go to church, definitely are more likely to be monogamous and have successful marriages. But I think when you look at how monogamy did spread around the world, really between kind of the 1800s to the early 1900s, that's when you saw China, Japan, Russia, all these countries adopt monogamy, India too. So, when you look at, some of the cultures I just mentioned, Buddhism, when you look at maybe not necessarily Islam, but Confucianism, they are compatible with monogamy, but they don't necessarily prescribe it like Christianity did. But once the Western model of monogamy was so obviously superior to the polygamous norms, then you saw all the rest of those cultures adopt it. But I don't think there's any evidence that says if you believe in Hinduism versus Christianity, that Christianities are better at monogamous marriage. Faith overall is an indicator, but I don't believe there's any evidence that any one particular faith or Christian domination is better at marriage than any other.
The most recent of the revolutions you outline is moral relativism, individualism when it comes to marriage, relationships, and this idea that perhaps we are providing economic incentives for broken families. How did this come about?
Yeah, unfortunately, you can see it right there in the data. So, for pretty much the entirety of the time that the United States Census existed, from pretty much the Civil War on, about 75% of all households in the United States were led by married couples. Okay, that started falling pretty much in the 1970s after a Supreme Court case called King v. Smith. Okay, and so what happened in this case is you had what it was originally was aid to dependent children, which was later changed to aid to families with dependent children. When this was administered, it was financed by the federal government, but administered by the states. So states would then go around and make sure that households that were receiving this aid were good households, were worthy of the benefit. And so one of the rules they had was so-called man of the house rules that checked to make sure that women were not sleeping with the man who should be providing for the mother in question. So in 1968, you had welfare advocates in Alabama challenge Alabama's man of the house rules, and Congress sided with the welfare advocates. Now, Alabama argued at the time, if you got rid of this man of the house rule, what that meant was women were now faced with a choice. If you wanted to live with a man, as most women do, you could either A, marry that man and lose your welfare benefits, or B, not marry that man, cohabitate with him, or date him and still get the benefits. So you forced that choice upon them. And then since then, in the immediate decade after that, the percentage of young Black women who were married fell from like 60% all the way down to 20% and has never recovered. So when you look at today's modern welfare state, you have a lot of liberals, a lot of Democrats who say that, look, the welfare penalties within TANF, where the AFDC program is now TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, that program is small and not many people use it. And so you can't really say that caused the decline of marriage. And they're right to an extent. What they ignore is the huge expansion of means-tested programs beyond TANF, beyond specifically welfare. That includes Section 8 housing, it includes food stamps, it includes Medicaid, it includes Obamacare subsidies. And you can go through, and there's different studies on each one of these. For example, there's a great study on Medicaid expansion, showing that the Medicaid expansion after Obamacare, because it went into effect at different states at different times, definitely did decrease marriage among the exact populations you'd expect it to, poor working class men and women. So you can see these marriage penalties at effect in isolation. But when you put them all together, the state and federal government spend over $1 trillion a year punishing marriage through these means-tested programs. So that's just a huge incentive for women to choose being married to the state over being married to a man.
Conn Carroll with us. He is the author of the recent book, Sex and the Citizen, How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. A key question: as long as sex is consensual, are other people harmed when unmarried people choose to have sex? And we go back to the beginning of the conversation and the consequences. Exacerbating wealth and income inequality, worsening political polarization, and then, of course, the population decline and the decline in the births in our country. What are these consequences that we should be concerned about as people are working on the assault on marriage?
Yeah, I was surprised in researching this book, a quote, I don't know if you read that quote from the book, but there's a very close quote to it from Jonathan Turley, who has kind of become more of a conservative voice in the Biden era and in the Trump era. But he was actually more of a libertarian before, and he represented a number of polygamous families who wanted to have their marriages recognized, or at least not criminalized by the state. And so he makes that argument that, what goes on behind closed doors sexually is only affects the people in that relationship in that time, and it doesn't affect anyone else. And as I point out in the chapter you just kind of outlined, that's just simply not true. And that once the state is not able to funnel sexual desire into monogamous unions, so many other things fall apart. You mentioned, income inequality, because it's generational. Particularly young men do not grow up, do not attain the discipline, do not have, as I put it, the role models needed to transition from adolescence into being a successful adult. And so what that means is that when you look at the outcomes for unmarried families, when you look at the outcomes for boys, they are particularly bad. And that really starts then milling into a longer cycle of once one generation has more males that are not as economically successful, that just means fewer marriages in the next generation. Mm-hmm. And so you just get this poverty cycle that we unfortunately see in a lot of communities today.
So, Conn, why does marriage work? Why does it bring us all these benefits? Why is it better than, say, simple cohabitation when you want to live together but not get married?
Yeah, it's kind of like that adage that, democracy is the worst form of government, but all the others, So I do have a chapter in the book, Why Marriage Works. And the thesis of the chapter is basically that, look, as humans, we have these emotional and physical intimacy needs that have to be met. Okay, they're not as pressing as the need for water or the need for food, but they exist and they're strong and they need to be met. So how are you going to meet them? Is it going to be through cohabitation, which is a lot less structured and a lot more unstable? Is it through polyamory? Is it through polygamy? So there's actually a lot of research been done on all of these institutions of how humans live together and meet their emotional and physical and intimacy needs. And monogamous marriage comes out on top compared to all the others. You just have a lot more crime and abuse with polygamy. Polyamory, you just have a lot of divorce. Cohabitation, the relationships through cohabitation are a lot more unstable, don't last as long through monogamous marriage. So, look, divorce happens. People are human. Marriage is not some silver bullet that if you walk down the aisle and say, I do, your life is suddenly going to be perfect. Marriages work. But overall, it is the best institution to not just channel your individual needs, but society's overall, their needs for physical, emotional intimacy into this institution that has proven to be the best way to encourage human flourishing.
Conn Carroll with us, his recent book, Sex and the Citizen, How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. We have, over the past decade, more than that, this idea of perhaps American citizens being married to the state. People might remember the character Julia from, goodness gracious, more than a decade ago at this point, as the Obama administration was trying to describe how a single woman's interactions with the state, with the government, could perhaps replace all of these benefits of marriage. Why does being married to the state not give us the same sense of both satisfaction and the same sense of wholeness?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I think that the main one is that a lot for especially the children, especially the males there, you don't have that male role model there. But, kind of more important than that is, you can't snuggle the state at night. The state's not going to sit on the couch and listen to you. The state is just not another person who can sit down and really connect with you, but another person is. And so, when you look at a lot of the feminist project and what they're trying to accomplish, a lot is unfortunately specifically trying to undermine marriage in order to promote female success in the professional workplace. And so I have this quote from Hannah Rosen in the book, who says flat out that women's professional success is due to the decline of marriage. And I just think that's a mistake to encourage women to become married independent of the state and not to meet those needs when in the form of a real person.
So what do we do about this assault on marriage? How do we encourage marriage? You write a bit about lessons we can learn perhaps from some things the U.S. military have implemented.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I actually suggest that we adopt the military's promotion of marriage. But what they did decide when they went away from the draft was that they needed to find a way to keep a more stable amount of people in the force. And what they did is they encouraged marriage. So if you get married, you flat out get a bonus. which would be great, but I don't even think we need to go that far. And then if you get married, you also get better housing benefits than if you were not married. So there's some ways in which the armed forces encourage marriage. And if you look at the numbers, the armed forces, even without the higher educations of certain other demographics, is they're getting married like was the 1950s. So these incentives, these bonuses are shown to work. But I think most importantly, we have to start with is we have to stop that $1 trillion that's being spent every year punishing marriage. And that doesn't mean we have to get rid of the entire social welfare state. It doesn't mean we have to get rid of Medicaid and Section 8 housing and food stamps and everything else. But we do need to get rid of the marriage penalties within those programs. And then another area I really look at is making young men more marriageable. So there are a lot of young women out there who I meet and talk to who say, look, I want to get married, but I can't find a guy that's worthy of my love. And I say, you're right in a lot of cases. I'm not going to say that there's a lot of men out there because of when you look at wage growth over the past 50 years, since 1970, wage growth for college-educated men has gone through the roof. Wage growth for women of all education levels has risen. But when you look at low-skill male wages, those have actually fallen since 1970. And that's just one way that makes them less marriageable. There's some ways we can address that. We can limit low-skill immigration so that the jobs available for those men are pay more. We can limit trade to China, which has just destroyed manufacturing. But there's some other things we could do that are kind of new on the radar that maybe don't fit into a left-right mold that we should look into. So for example, just watch sports any weekend. 5-10 years ago, there would be no advertisements for online gambling at all. Now you can't watch 5 seconds of an NFL football game or even a college football game and be bombarded with go online and bet, go online and bet, going online and bet. Well, we have studies now because states have legalized it at different times, and the impact of legalized online gambling is just terrible. Huge increases in bankruptcies, huge increases in credit card debt. And again, guess who it's affecting the most? It's affecting those young men that we need getting their lives together and becoming marriageable men. It is hurting them the most. And so that is really one of the big issues that we need to tackle if we want to save marriage.
Conn Carroll, we just went through an election cycle where seemingly everything in some way was a threat to democracy. So your book says the assault on marriage also is destroying democracy. How so?
Well, a number of ways. I mean, as I detail in the chapter of the destruction of democracy, income inequality undermines democracy. There's studies on that. So does wealth inequality. When people don't believe that by playing by the rules and working hard, they can get ahead, that undermines democracy. So if you have a decreasing social mobility because of marriage, that's also going to decrease belief in democracy. Same with crime. You can't have high crime in democratic institutions. But one really that I zero in on is polarization, which, since the Democratic Party within the past 20 years or so has really become the party of the single woke female. Mm-hmm. And pretty much, if you look at the Kamala Harris, right, and all of those issues that she realized were so far left when she got the nomination that she had to walk all of them back. Talk about the trans stuff, talk about decriminalizing the border. Those are all issues that were pushed that have their highest support among the single woke female demographic. It is single woke females that have driven the Democratic Party so far to the left that everyone on that stage in 2020, when asked, do you believe that the border should be decriminalized? Joe Biden was the only one that didn't raise his hand. Everyone else did. And that is a position that was driven by the decline of marriage because of the polarization of single woke females.
Conn Carroll is commentary editor at the Washington Examiner, WashingtonExaminer.com. Find him on X at Conn Carroll. And his latest book is Sex and the Citizen, How the Assault on Marriage is Destroying Democracy. Conn, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Up next, Brent Cline joins us. He's from Hillsdale's English department. We'll begin a discussion on the Harlem Renaissance movement. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hillsdale College is a small, Christian, classical liberal arts college that operates independently of government funding, and we want you or your son or daughter to apply. At Hillsdale, students grow in heart and mind. by studying timeless truths in a supportive community dedicated to the highest things. Hillsdale College costs significantly less than other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges and receives regular recognition as a best value, and nearly all students receive financial aid. Our robust core curriculum, vibrant student life, and 8-to-1 student-to-faculty ratio make for an education like no other. For more information or to fill out an application, visit hillsdale.edu/info. That's hillsdale.edu/info.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to follow us on X for updated show and guest information. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We're joined by Dr. Brent Cline. He is Associate Professor of English here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Cline, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Beginning today, a series of interviews on the Harlem Renaissance. And this first conversation will give us a good overview background on this movement. Tell us as we begin the era we're talking about, some of the social, cultural, economic factors that contributed to what we now call the Harlem Renaissance.
Like any era or movement that you might consider, the idea of a beginning and the idea of an ending is going to be somewhat fuzzy, but you can roughly put it at World War I, the end of World War I, to some people put it around the Great Depression, 1929, but I think more fairly, you can think start of World War II. That's about when it's over.
How did the Great Migration influence the Harlem Renaissance, both in terms of the themes explored in this literature and the influx of talent to Harlem?
Yeah, because it's not as though Harlem is the only place this Renaissance is happening. It's happening in Chicago. It's happening in St. Louis. But the Great Migration is incredibly important. But it's as chaotic as it is unifying. Because when you mention the Great Migration, so just for your listeners, the Great Migration is this decades-long process of African Americans moving from the South to the North, and it's almost always moving from rural South to urban North. And when the very contours of what you think of with an American city is forming with the Great Migration. When I teach the Harlem Renaissance, I ask students where they're from, and if they're from rural Michigan or rural Indiana, I ask them, okay, what's the racial demographics? And of course, it's almost always white, and now perhaps Hispanic as well. Mm-hmm. And I ask them, well, why is that? Like, why is that the case? Because if you go down to low country South Carolina, that's certainly not the case.
Right.
And it's because when you're migrating to the cities almost always. And so the Great Migration is happening because of Jim Crow. It's happening because of increased industry in the North. So there's a push-pull going on, being pushed away from the South, being pulled toward the North. And when you come to Harlem, it's not as though Harlem is empty. Mm-hmm. So you have Northern African Americans who are urbanites taking in these large numbers of rural Southerners, and they don't get along. And this is actually represented in a lot of the literature. In fact, one of the great conflicts of the Harlem Renaissance, because I think you can think about that era as much as an era of rival factions as much as a unified idea, is what are we as a race in this country? What are we as a people? And is that to include these Southern rural folk who are coming that we think perhaps we're a little bit better than, and yet at the same time, these Southern rural folk represent a heritage that in the 20th century is really just beginning to be wrestled with. I mentioned in terms of beginnings, around World War I, but one of the reasons World War I is a beginning for the Harlem Renaissance is because in the late 19th century, you have this growth of for lack of a better term, a black bourgeoisie. You're having more and more black professionals, and their relationship with their heritage, their relationship with slavery and the South in general is extremely fraught with problems. And one of the more important figures of the Harlem Renaissance is James Weldon Johnson. And one of the important things he does is he creates an anthology of spirituals, which for us in the 21st century, we just think of spirituals like, oh, of course, we all know what spirituals are. And they are performed by both black, white, all kinds of racial choirs. But at the beginning of the 20th century, it's much more of a, how are we supposed to feel about it? Are we ashamed of this? Or is this something we're going to embrace? And you can sort of see that play out with the Great Migration and this movement towards the north. So, the Great Migration is important in terms of an influx of cash, an influx of people, an influx of energy, but also an influx of conflict of not only with the individuals, but who are we? Who are we in terms of the South? Who are we in terms of the North? Who are we in terms of the past?
Talking with Dr. Brent Cline about the Harlem Renaissance, what were some of the key themes, some of the key motifs presented in Harlem Renaissance literature, and how do they reflect the experiences that you just talked about and perhaps the aspirations of African Americans during this time?
Yeah, there are literal books written on subsections of this very question, but I think very broadly you can think of the Harlem Renaissance as an artistic coming of age whose most important questions are, who were we? Looking backwards towards not only slavery, but then post-emancipation, because the Harlem Renaissance is roughly 50 years of post-emancipation. Who were we? Who are we right now? And then what is it that we want to become? And those questions are the answers, are contradictory. Different writers take completely different tacks. I'm going to embrace this. I'm going to reject this. This is my heritage. No, this is not my heritage. So I think all things considered, that's the most umbrella way of understanding it. But then you can think about that economically. You can think about that politically. So for instance, W.E.B. Du Bois is he is a Harlem Renaissance kingmaker. He is arguably the godfather of the Harlem Renaissance, and he's interested in not only the cultural aspirations of Black Americans, but also the political aspirations. But then he's responding to a generation before him with Booker T. Washington, so the 19th century, who says, don't get involved in politics, Black Americans. Let's just deal with economics. The benevolent whites will let us have our economics and we won't ask for anything more. So that idea of Booker T. Washington is still in the water during the Harlem Renaissance. And so how much this plays out in politics, how much this plays out in economics, how much this plays out in art is individualized in different groups and different authors. You mentioned Du Bois. Who are some of the other notable writers, poets, intellectuals that we associate with the Harlem Renaissance movement? It's fair to think about it as a couple generations, those who created it, and then those who sustained it. And the creators would be people like Du Bois. It would be someone like James Weldon Johnson, who I mentioned, Jesse Redmond Fawcett, who really help shepherd young writers. James Weldon Johnson and Fawcett really are more important as shepherds than they are individual writers. Claude McKay would be one of those first generations who was a Jamaican poet and novelist. And then you move into the second generation. When you get to the second generation, that might be some of the authors that your audience is more familiar with. Now you've got Langston Hughes, you've got Zora Neale Hurston, you have Nella Larson, Jean Toomer, where that first generation says, hey, we're establishing this, and the second generation says, here's the flourishing of it. And then by that third generation, things are starting to crumble. And maybe there's something metaphorical in that. You can sort of see an arc that's constant in American history, if not all history, where you have the first generation that founds something, the second generation reaps the harvest of that, and then the third generation, for circumstances inside or outside their control, things just start slipping away. How is what the Harlem Renaissance authors are doing compare or contrast to what else is happening in American literature around that same period? Well, this is one of the reasons I like teaching the Harlem Renaissance, and I tell students, the Harlem Renaissance is American literature in 2 decades. Because you have writers like Jesse Redmond Fawcett, Countee Cullen, who look backwards toward British, really not really American so much, but British Romanticism, British Victorian writings and then say, we are the continuation of that. But then you have writers like Jean Toomer and Langston Hughes who say, no. We are doing something very, very different in a lot of this modernist experimentation. But what's funny, like you look at an author like Jean Toomer who wrote Cain, which is this very difficult, frustrating, obscure, and absolutely beautiful work of short stories and poems. And that sounds a lot like what Faulkner is doing. Mm-hmm. But it's about 6 years before Faulkner really arrives on the scene and starts working with that kind of modernist experimentation. That's not to say Jean Toomer isn't riding off the wave of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and European modernists. But when you look at the Harlem Renaissance, you can look at the 19th century writing and see them trying to continue that. And then you can see them being avant-garde with what's happening in the 20th century writing as well. You know, one thing I would want people to know about the Harlem Renaissance is it's not simply a mimicry of what's going on, of like, oh, well, we can study this, but let's just study the white authors who are doing it better or something like that, because these black authors are just trying to imitate. It's like, no, even those authors like Cullen and Fawcett who are doing something more connected to a British past, they're still evolving it. And then you have this experimentation that really, if you're looking at 20 years of American literature and trying to get the widest breadth of representation, I don't think you can beat the Harlem Renaissance.
Do we see its influence remain today in some works of American literature?
Yes. The short answer, yes. So I mean, it's this crucible of incredibly chaotic and beautiful activity, and then generations from then on start responding to it. So you can certainly look at, Lorraine Hansberry is going to be responding to it in the 1950s. Then you're going to get to the Black Power movement and the Black Pride movement in the 60s and 70s, and you'll see it there. And then you'll see Toni Morrison, 1970s, as a continuation of that Black Pride movement, and then moving in, borrowing some from Faulkner and borrowing some from the Harlem Renaissance. I think you can see it in Jesmond Ward. I think you can see it in Colson Whitehead, sort of wrestling with not only the ideas of the Harlem Renaissance, of who were we, who are we, what do we want to be, but also how do we best then represent that? And do we represent that by being a part of an American canon, or are we a separate canon unto itself? And that's one of the important issues of the Harlem Renaissance, is that idea of separatism versus integration. Are we trying to be a part of something, or do we realize that we can't ever be, and so we're doing our own thing? And Du Bois would represent, no, we are going to integrate, we are going to be a part of this larger idea of what is American. And then you have someone like, I can't say philosopher, but a separatist like Marcus Garvey, who is going to help usher in this century-long idea of separatism, both politically, but culturally and artistically as well.
Dr. Brent Cline, he is Associate Professor of English at Hillsdale College. As we begin our introduction into the Harlem Renaissance, we'll talk next time about some specific writers from this period. Dr. Cline, thanks so much for joining us on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Scott.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Larry Arnn, President of Hillsdale College, Conn Carroll, author of the new book Sex and the Citizen, and Brent Cline from Hillsdale's English Department. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.